So this workshop is about handling professional disagreement with grace and diplomacy. Now, before we actually get into it, I really want to just stress that these points that I'll be highlighting today, that we'll be looking at today, those are, in my experience, through working in different companies and different countries, these are the ones that have worked for me. So they're not like, definitive solutions that they are going to work for everyone. And the main focus of this workshop is to hopefully, so that you'll be more aware of different situations, so that you can make up your minds in what kind of things that you want to use. More importantly, what we're looking at today, I'm basically just touching on the surface on on these points. And we could be talking about this for a very long time. So hopefully I'll be able to to offer you some things that you can take away and be able to use them for your own advantage. So here are the bits that we'll be looking at today. So defining and analyzing soft skills. So 3 tiers of effective communication. See, my computer's okay. Language and soft skills in email writing. So we're pretty much going to be focusing on the writing part, communication in emailing. This will also work with messaging, but all in all, so not so much with the speaking for now, but the concept and how it works will apply anyway. So practice using language and soft skills to resolve a conflict in an email. Right. Okay. So this is something that I kind of worked out. So there are 3 tiers of how to be more effective in handling professional disagreements. So there are 3 tiers. So the first tier, the basic, the foundation, is personality traits, thought patterns, and attitudes. The second tier, context-related skills, and the third one, language. Okay, we're going to look at each one in more detail. So as the foundation, when people talk about soft skills, is more about the sort of these kind of personality traits. So with critical thinking, honesty, being honest, empathy, intellectual humility, adaptability, listening skills, open-mindedness, diplomacy, and decisiveness. So all these elements are, in my opinion, are the foundations of how everything works. So this is the context. So after the foundation, after understanding, having those personality traits, it's important to understand, what you're doing. So here, like collaborating in a project, so negotiating for a mutually beneficial outcome in all kind of environments, resolving conflicts between different individuals of hierarchy, maybe your peers, maybe your students, maybe your bosses, maybe maybe your counterparts in other universities of different rank, different status, and also culture. Providing feedback, corresponding effectively in writing and speaking, and asking for assistance. Finally, okay, the top. So once you've done the foundation and then the intermediate part, so now the language will kind of top it off. So here are the points that we'll be looking at today. First of all, whether simple sentences versus complex sentences. Simple sentences kind of meaning like simple subject verb sentences. Linkers, how we use linkers. Phrasal verbs versus formal single words. Hedging, I forgot to put a bullet point there. It's important to hedge. Also, contractions versus full forms, as most of you probably know that register is really important. And even when we're writing essays, academic writing, it's important to kind of understand the register. And with emails and messages, pronouns, more focused on subject pronouns are very important. Here are some of ways to improve the discussion. So, and here again, right, please let me just reiterate myself. These are my points. So these are kind of what things work for me. So first point, do not take disagreements personally. even though that, the person that you were talking to might be quite arrogant, might be quite argumentative, or might be quite rude, consider that maybe that person just actually is having a bad day. Point two, focus on the task, because you're all there for a specific reason. Think about the outcome that you're trying to reach. Reflect on yourself first. The person that that you're talking to may be behaving in a way that you don't really like, or maybe a bit brusque, or maybe a bit rude, maybe because of something that you did. Right? I'm not saying that that's definitely the case, but think about yourself first. Have a think whether it was something that you might have done, maybe consciously or unconsciously. Maybe that you were also having a bad day, or maybe you just kind of like not seeing eye to eye in some elements. Do not treat it as a competition. So this part, for me, I think is quite important, especially when we're collaborating. That we're not trying to win anything. We're trying to reach something together. If you do not know something, don't be afraid to ask. So often, so many people, they're worried, whether at school, whether at university, whether they're actually in a professional environment with peers. They're afraid that they don't want to look stupid. They're worried that if they raise their hand, or if they want to ask a question, people will look at them differently. But please, the idea is that there are no stupid questions. If you're not sure, ask. Do not assume other people will have the same expectations as you. And this is also about being your behavior. So, for example, maybe I would behave in this way. It doesn't mean that other people would also do the same. So it's important to kind of also think about that. In whether it's in writing or just speaking, say please, thank you. Doesn't cost anything. It's always good to be polite, like somebody said, Natalia mentioned, using polite language. And finally, put yourself in the other person's position. Think about how that person would react if you have reacted in that kind of same way. Okay, so the next part is I'm going to show you an email from a manager to an employee. How you would feel if you received this email yourself. Okay, it's just about feelings. Nothing really positive. So most of you have suggested that it's not a very pleasant email. Okay. Now, for this task, I actually conducted a poll, like a survey with SurveyMonkey. So I sent the letter out in the same way and just asked exactly the same question about how people might feel, how the respondents might feel. If you can have a look at the results. So there were not so many. I mean, I didn't get so many respondents, maybe around 50 or so. So 4% felt that the email was okay, and the email is fine. 21% felt that, well, it was also okay because the recipient, was initially at fault. So they had initially made the mistake first. 4%, another 4% didn't feel anything either way, and a massive 71%, 72% pretty much felt the same kind of way as most of you did. And on the right, you can see, so most the respondents were American, Australian, British, Portuguese, Russian, and South African. Now, one point that I would like to make is that out of the whole data, right? So in this 72%, there were actually nearly everyone, like all the different nationalities, all were in this 72%. In this small part, so we were looking at like Americans, Australian, and British as people whose first language is English. So In this ball part, there were no Americans, Australian, or British people here. So although like also the Portuguese and also Russians and South Africans, also some of them shared similar kind of views that the email was quite rude and quite confusing as well. There were no native English speaking people within this part. So that we will look at a little bit later. So one of the points that trying to make is that culturally speaking, which is maybe a bit more difficult to grasp, which of course in this session I'm also going to show you some points where maybe how you can look at these points, think about how you could use the language. Now of course I'm not saying that all Americans, Australians, or British, or native English speakers are always very polite. What I'm saying is that even if we are quite rude, and even if we have those personality traits which are not very accommodating, not very kind towards others, we have a filter. So we understand what something is okay and something is not okay, which is why it's important to bear in mind, those kind of elements. Now, next question. So one of the parts, one of the points that some of the respondents made was that if the employee was initially at fault, was it okay for the manager to reply in this tone? No. Wow. Okay. Wow. Quite a definitive no going on here. Wow. Exclamation mark. Yes. So somebody said yes. Okay. Right. If it's a if it's not a long conflict, depends on the aim and blaming. Okay. For this task, so using the same email, and underline the examples of these language points. So there are 6 of them. So use of second person subject pronoun, so you. Words with a negative connotation, so words that make you feel kind of quite uncomfortable. Emphatic words, words that would make the sentence stronger in feeling. Simple subject and verb sentences. Direct and blunt language, and typos. The feelings that the email generated, well, maybe the feeling or the feelings were not very pleasant. So I'm going to show you some examples of how they can be improved. So the first point I'm going to show you is about the use of second person subject pronouns. So here are all the ones which you could see. Quite a lot of them. So in my opinion, so how can this be improved? So instead of focusing on what the person did or didn't do, focus more on shifting the focus by using we. Unfortunately, we will have to do this, rather than saying that, you didn't do this. So instead of you did not pass last year's certification in our center, have not examined for more than a year, and therefore were not mentioned, were not monitored. First of all, we haven't been able to conduct any monitoring. So this takes the tone away from the recipient, that what they didn't do, but something that we couldn't do together. The next point was about words with negative connotations. So words like refuse, removed. So this already has a feeling that it's not nice, it's not good. I didn't offer any context within for this email, because I kind of wanted just to focus on this particular email without giving a lot of information, because I kind of feel that with more information, there would be an automatic kind of like an unconscious kind of like feeling towards them, right? But bearing in mind, this was for last year, so in 2020, so there was a pandemic, right? So even though that I didn't show any information prior or after this email, it's important that, this should be taken into consideration. With the language itself, whether you disagree or agree, using these kind of words would make the person feel quite at fault. So the way to reformulate these words to maybe into a more positive way is, instead of if you refuse to come for certification this year, if you're not able to attend our certification this year, um, use like can or something that we can't do instead. Um, so instead of thinking about, limitations, what we can't do, you refuse, right? Or that constraint is that you are being restricted, that there is some kind of control over you. Try to think about, more possibilities and opportunities, so that, if you're not able to, right? It has a kind of like a different kind of feeling. And also, instead of trying to point out faults, point out maybe quite similar to what I kind of pointed out at the beginning, that um, try to understand that the other person is doing something maybe because that person also finds something quite difficult. So understand the more differences between the two of you, rather than, pointing faults. So the word refuse here, it's a very strong word. Is that okay, you should do it, and you only like do not do it because you don't want to do it. Emphatic words. First of all, the word even adds like a very strong negative kind of feeling. If you're not sure, try to remove it. So for example, you can say, after enumerating different things, as far as I know, you haven't worked for something for nearly a year. So now, but instead you're saying, as far as I know, you haven't even worked for this place for nearly a year. So that even um, makes it really strong. It almost feels like that, somebody mentioned that, a parent punishing a child. And then with the two ands here, um, with, well, of course, it doesn't always relate to any of you, perhaps. When I teach exam writing, I try to, well, I always tell my students to, avoid using and as to start a sentence. It adds an emphasis that is usually not very much liked by other people. And also, um, I mean, it's used in more fictional kind of writing, and maybe like, with your friends, it's okay as long as you know one another quite well. But it's kind of like, it doesn't break the sentence, but it just makes it okay. And you haven't done this, and you didn't do that, and you did this, right? So be aware of these kind of words. So these are some of the emphatic words. Avoid using these. Even, absolutely. Um, Especially when you're talking negative, something which is quite negative. Of course, if you're talking about something positive, it's fine. The difference between quite disappointing and utterly disappointing, um, the strength is very noticeable. Simple subject verb sentences. Subject, verb, object, simple sentences. I'm not saying that simple subject verb sentences should not be used. Um, there should be a balance between some complex ones and some more simpler ones, so that it creates more of a fluidity. And I think that also here it's emphasized more because of these use. Instead of, you did not pass last year's certification in our center, have not examined in for more than a year, and therefore were not monitored. Here is an example. Using as, like because. And the sentence is longer and it is more complex. It's not so blunt like this, this, and this. Moving on. Direct, blunt language. This kind of pretty much involves pretty much everything here. Will be. I think first conditionals can always be can also be quite negative, like when it is used in a negative ways, the feeling is that, if you don't do this, you will not do this, which is kind of more like a threat. You will be removed. So these kind of very I mean, in this talk, we're not going to talk about so much about tentative language, but maybe, using more kind of like tentative language, like, might, may, should or could, that, using more kind of like kind of these kind of modal verbs would kind of like reduce the elements of this kind of strength. So instead of you haven't even worked, like, well, you have taken a leave of absence. Yeah, and also since the beginning of the pandemic. So here it kind of registers that, okay, there was a bit of a problem because of the pandemic. So, this is what you decided. Finally, in that last part, typos. Not so many. Not sure. I don't know whether you spotted this. So it should have been like more than a year, and therefore were not monitored. Now, in my opinion, for me, when I write, whether it's a short message to somebody, whether it's on WhatsApp, Telegram, and a short email to one of my teachers, whether it's to my boss, to anyone, I check, I double check, because it just kind of shows a bit more care. Okay, maybe sometimes we feel that we don't have a lot of time. I'd rather wait to have some time to actually write it properly than to rush it. Yeah, so it makes a difference. Maybe not to everyone. And again, here, this is more about me, right? So with the experiences I have, like, when some of the resources that I've seen, typos are something that we should avoid where we can. And how do we improve that? Check it. Yeah. I mean, as a teacher, I always, ask my students to, check, their writing before submitting it. So it's important that, maybe that we could also do the same too. So in this part, in task 4, this is the original letter on the left and an alternative version on the right. Only the first paragraph. You can see that the right side is a lot longer. Now, compare the original letter with the alternative version, only the first part, and underline the differences in the language points discussed. So these are the points which I want you to highlight. So only 4 points. Now, I'm going to show you what I've highlighted, okay? And maybe you can see whether you have matched them yourself, okay? So for pleasantries, as you can see on here, generally speaking, it is of utmost importance that, it's really important that when you write to somebody, you include these. I mean, we should not miss pleasantries, wishing somebody well, show some sympathy, especially during some difficult times, right? respect. So these phrases and these words, especially at the beginning, they're really, really important. Okay, moving on. For the next part is about using linkers to strengthen logic. Some discourse markers, some linkers, some dependent clauses. It stretches the meaning out a bit more to so it's not so blunt. It presents the logic, yes, but also it makes the language more fluid. That one point leads to another, leads to another, leads to another. Okay, the third point is avoid second person subject pronouns, you. So as I mentioned before, using we, right? So it's not just about being very accusatory, what you did not do, but more about that we couldn't do this together. Okay, finally, hedging. Again, more to the point, maybe something to reflect on. Instead of using will or haven't, being very accusatory, use more like ability, different kind of modal words, verbs, more tentative language. The overall tone is a lot more positive, more inclusive, that we care, right? So there is definitely like an element of care involved there. Right, next task. So on your own, rewrite the next paragraph of the same email in a more polite tone. Remember to include the language points discussed in the last part. So those four elements, being pleasant, using linkers, avoiding second person subject pronouns, and using a bit of hedging. As a bit of a summary, okay, so just wrapping things up. So things to avoid. Writing or replying to somebody when you're feeling emotionally charged. If possible, wait for a day or two. Avoid assuming your recipient will have the same expectations as you, which is one of the points I kind of like mentioned earlier. Um, avoid using second person subject pronouns. Yeah, so some other point is using exclamation marks. So, I see a lot of people when after greetings, especially, dear Aaron, and then exclamation mark. We don't do that unless you know the person really well, because it can be seen as quite abrupt and quite rude, because exclamation. Also, another point which I didn't mention before is don't use thanks in advance, especially when you're asking somebody to help you, um, because the person actually hasn't agreed to help. So by saying thanks in advance, you're putting them in quite a difficult position, and maybe they're not very they won't be very comfortable with that. And of course, one I mentioned is typos. Have a look; they show care, a lack of care. So as I said before, check things to remember. Now, and this is in general. So when somebody writes, please remember to reply. In my experience, sometimes when I write to my school, sometimes when I write to other people, they don't write back. And it kind of creates, like a situation. Maybe I'm thinking, oh, maybe I did something wrong. Why is the person, not writing back to me? So please remember to write back. Remember pleasantries, which even though that, some of you were having problems with writing the actual email itself, you all remembered, being pleasant, saying thank you, showing, empathy. The third point, if you're not sure about something, ask. Don't be afraid to ask. Of course, when we ask, it's also important to use the correct language. Can I, I would like to ask a question, but if you don't know, ask. The next point is, please use please. Say thank you. Don't be afraid to apologize. It's about being sincere. The next point is use could and would instead of can and will. So using these kind of modals as like in the past form creates more distance, and distancing is another method of creating hedging. Of course, that is like a completely like something we can talk about, by itself, for quite a long time. But distancing will create more formality. One of you mentioned that whether it's okay to use contractions. Yes, it is okay to use contractions, because it falls down to the next point: being genuine, being honest, and being sincere. Now, whether you want to be more formal or less formal, it's up to you. In this kind of workshop, what I don't want to do is to offer you any cliches saying that you have to use this phrase, you can't use that phrase. Um, it's not how we communicate. And so it's important that when you're writing, you think about those three tiers within the pyramid. You think about being genuine and being kind and being respectful. You think about the situation. Even when you're collaborating with somebody, maybe designating tasks, trying to delegate tasks, you know suggest rather than definitely tell somebody to do something. Maybe this would be a better idea, rather than saying I want you to do this. Yeah. So by creating, using, maybe you could do this, rather than maybe you can do this, that will create a bit more distance, and create a bit more politeness. The main idea, I think here, is that if you were put in the other person's position, how would you like to feel? Okay, so that is all from me.